These billionaires are saying school teachers making $40K a year are the problem. Not the billionaires who've immiserated us and just like run the country. No, it's the elementary school teachers, not the billionaires.
Jason Stanley is an American philosopher, professor of philosophy at Yale University, and the author of several books, including How Fascism Works, which he came on our show to discuss back in 2020 in an episode called Falling for Fascism. Today we're discussing his newest book, Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future, so that we can better understand some of the attacks on educational institutes at home and abroad, and how authoritarian movements purposefully repress and reject historical truths in favor of a different narrative that benefits their attempts at grabbing more and more power away from the people. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I am just thrilled to welcome back Jason to our show. Jason, you had one of probably our favorite episodes of American Hysteria of all time when you came on to talk about How Fascism Works, one of your previous books. So I know everyone is going to be really excited to hear from you.
Well, it's great to be on this show again, and I really admire the work you've been doing.
It's an honor to hear, for sure. Okay, so let's get into it. We are going to be talking a little bit more about your new book, Erasing History. And before we really dive into that, I thought that maybe we could just talk a little bit about how fascism works as a refresher. You know, Jason, you're like someone I've looked up to for the last, 5 years since I came across your work, because you are kind of prescient, like you seem to be able to kind of predict where we're going. But I know that you've kind of been accused of being a little bit of an alarmist, which I don't agree with. But I think that when you use the term fascism, and you talk about this in your books, sometimes it can be this buzzword that people reject right away because they think it's somehow incompatible with the United States, with our government and culture, that it's like too dramatic. So maybe we could lay out the pillars of what you call fascism so we can just be on the same page, whether we're using that word or not. So can you talk about what you mean when you use that term and some of the pillars that you talked about in your first book?
So fascism is a cult of the leader. Characteristically, European fascism is a cult of the leader who promises national restoration in response to supposed national humiliation by immigrants, LGBTQ citizens, and national minorities, like Jews in Germany, for example, Muslims in India. The idea is that the nation is the greatest nation on earth, the greatest nation in human history. And it has been hindered from this recognition by globalists and liberals who open up the border to immigrants and seek to swamp out the dominant group that has made the nation great. And you need a restoration of masculinity in response to this, because these globalists are destroying the heroic men, the great men who made the nation what they are. And they're trying to poison the blood of the people by bringing down the dominant group, by race mixing, by taking over positions of power and basically dismantling the country. So you need a strong leader who's not going to make compromises, who's going to smash everything to restore the nation's greatness. Now, to make this kind of thing work, you need some things in place. You need a mythical past. You need this story about the nation's past where it was created by great men. Hitler said, we need to say Germany is the successor of ancient Greece and Rome.
Right.
The great men who established the nation must be the center of our education system. So you have a mythic past. You say, we were great. Create this nostalgia for the mythic past and anger at those who criticize it. So you say, here we were the greatest building, the greatest nation on earth, and people are criticizing the great men who built it. And they're criticizing, like right now, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany is trying to say, look, the Nazis were a speed bump, sure, but they did a lot of good things. They stopped Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
We were recognized as a great country throughout. So a mythic past.
Right.
Then you need, I'm just going to go through a few of them. You need dominant group victimhood. You need to say, oh my goodness, the dominant group, the Hindus in India, for example, are under terrible threat from the national minority and from immigrants. In fact, the dominant group are the most persecuted people on earth. So, for example, whites are the most persecuted people on earth. So nobody is as much of a whiner as the dominant group. There's no snowflakes like the dominant group. They don't get all the cookies. They just like lose their shit. I hope I can say that on American Hysteria.
You very well can.
And, think of men's rights movements. So, in terms of the whiners and complainers and snowflakes who are intimidated by feminism, there is just no snowflake greater than the members of the dominant group. So you create this dominant group victimhood. You use the mythic past to say the dominant group used to rule, and the dominant group is now threatened by equality, threatened by female equality. The national minority in a country always plays a very special role. So Palestinians in Israel, Muslims in India, a Hindu-dominated nation, because you can say, look, they're getting too many cookies. And if they get cookies, the country crumbles. And so we want to humiliate them. We want to say they're dangerous, they're criminals. So the immigrants are replacing. So victimhood, sexual anxiety. You say, oh, the national minority, the immigrants, LGBTQ citizens, they're coming for your children. They're coming for your family. And the strong leader will crush them. He'll send them to prison. He'll crush these groups. And so to preserve your daughter's virtue for another Hindu or another Aryan or another white person, because you wouldn't want them, or you wouldn't want your sons to become trans women. Like that is like the complete destruction. That would be the killing of your son. And then there's the structuring of the stereotypes that you say about the national minority and about immigrants. You say they're lazy and they're criminal. So you can do anything with them. They're lazy and they're criminal. And then you say they're corrupt. All fascist campaigns run anti-corruption campaigns. The fascist party is the most corrupt group of sort of mobsters imaginable. And they say everybody else is corrupt. And basically what you do is you say, for example, the courts are biased because when you do something illegal and you face the courts, they treat you in a neutral way, like you're just like anyone else. But that's bias from their perspective because they can do anything they want. Then you say like the minority group is corrupt and self-dealing. And so you need to replace them with excellent, competent people. But the people you replace them with are just other mob members that you have something over on who will just do what you say. So this structure, maybe it's completely foreign to the United States, but I'm just explaining it so people could see what it would look like if someday it would happen.
Yeah, and that I feel like really sums up what you talk about in your first book. And your new book kind of expands on, I believe, two of those pillars, which is the mythical past and then creating this ideology that rejects critical inquiry. And I'm curious why it was these two particular pillars or this, collection of thoughts that felt most important for you to make into an entire book.
So everybody knows that authoritarian governments target the media and the courts. That's obvious why they have to do it. So an authoritarian would, for example, threaten the media with lawsuits if they speak badly about him. That's what happens in foreign authoritarian countries. They basically put the media on blast. They say, it's often completely contradictory. Like the Nazis had their own newspapers that were often accused of hate speech. So they pushed for free speech. But as soon as they came into power, they smashed the other media. So what you do, what Nazis did is they said, well, we're being denied our free speech rights because we can't say all this hateful stuff. But then they got into power and they smashed the opposition media. And everybody knows, the courts get targeted. You say the courts are biased because they rule against you, and law is simply whatever the fascist leader wants, and his supporters, that's just law, whatever they want, whatever will enrich them. And so the courts are biased because they don't see that. So everybody knows that. But the education piece is vital here. People forget that fascists always target schools and universities. So if you look around the world and in the past, Vladimir Putin recently said wars are won by teachers. So you can easily overlook the attacks on schools and universities. But then you fail to see their centrality to fascism. You can convert a population very quickly to the dominant fascist ideology with the school system. Just look at Russia today. Or look at what happened under National Socialism when Germany went from much less anti-Semitic than France to much more anti-Semitic than France in a few short years.
Right.
So what I was seeing, and you see it now as we transition into a fascist dictatorship in the United States, you see now the media failing to highlight the attacks on universities. With some exceptions, Michelle Goldberg has written a couple good columns for the New York Times, but people generally fail to see, like the slashing of the NIH. The United States, the one thing we unquestionably do better than anyone in the world is education, higher education. Our higher education system, everywhere in the world, wealthy families send their kids to American universities. So they want to go after American universities. They want to make sure they're no longer so great. You can't get critical thinking in higher education in a country like China. You just get engineering. You get some history of Chinese philosophy that's crucial, but you don't get critical inquiry, the kind of stuff that makes people's blood boil because it criticizes the nation, it criticizes the ruling party. Liberal arts colleges do not exist in authoritarian countries. So you have to smash them, and you have to remake the education system to buttress these myths, to make the fascist politics work better, and to remove the perspectives underlying any kind of social movement that would challenge the fascist leader. And that means removing the perspectives of the people you're trying to vilify from schools. So if you're going after LGBTQ schools, like Russia immediately in 2013 made it illegal to have schools have books that represent LGBTQ perspectives. Soon thereafter, vicious hatred against LGBTQ citizens. Once you start saying, okay, this is not appropriate for children, then you're representing people with LGBTQ orientations as freaks and sort of dangerous for children. You eliminate the national minority. So in India, as they turn to ethnic fascism, Hindu fascism, they're eliminating Muslim perspectives and Muslim history from schools. So you want to look at, in a fascist, transition to a fascist dictatorship, what are they doing with the history of the national minorities? Is there a kind of war where you're making the dominant group feel panicked that the schools are teaching the perspective of the national minorities? The schools are teaching the perspectives of LGBTQ citizens. This stuff is indicative of the shift to fascism. And so this new book is focusing on the educational perspective, going through countries historically and across the world to show how that piece works, to explain why it is that in the transition to fascism, universities and schools often come first.
Right. Oh, man. Yeah. And it's obviously something that we're seeing right now, at least in its early to mid phase. And I mean, you've talked about this a little bit, but you kind of begin your new book by saying authoritarian regimes often find history profoundly threatening. So what is it exactly about people's history, like the, non-dominant group's history, that is this frightening to a fascist group?
Well, fascism requires you to make your citizens frightened of each other, because then you need the strong leader to protect you.
Mm-hmm.
If you explain that, for instance, Muslims have a perspective, belong to the country of India, they have a perspective, they have a way of looking at things, then you're not going to be afraid that a Muslim is going to marry your Hindu daughter.
Right.
If you recognize that LGBTQ citizens just want freedom and they've been prevented from that, having that their whole for the whole history of humanity, essentially, for large parts of it, and that they're not a threat to your children. They're not trying to convert anyone any more than heterosexuals are trying to convert people. Then you can't be like, okay, I'm going to protect you from this threat. Without fear, fascist politics doesn't work. So, for instance, if you have a large-scale social protest movement, you can use that to say, okay, you need me to protect you against this madness. And if you remove the history that showed, like, of the labor movement, for instance, or obviously Black history, I'm trying to describe the structure so people can fill things in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if you remove the perspective, then the social movement will just seem like a revolution, a violent riot. And so then you can represent yourself as protecting the nation. But fascism thrives on fear. You can't have fear if people basically get where the group that you're supposed to be fearful of is coming from.
Yeah. And I mean, it seems like that's something that we're seeing in a lot of universities during this recent push for Palestinian rights and protections. And I imagine that's something that you have faced at Yale and other places. And does this feel like what you're talking about in terms of that kind of repression of story and narrative and the truth of a culture?
Yeah, well, it's not even legal in American university. I mean, if you try to teach the perspective of the Palestinian people, you're risking your safety, your family's safety.
Ugh, yeah.
A bunch of Christian nationalists are claiming that they're going to protect my people, Jews. They're cynically doing it in order to go out to target universities. So, universities are the hotbeds of anti-war protests, the Vietnam War, Iraq War. The protests in the 60s against the Vietnam War were much more intense than any campus protests we've ever seen. But the Christian nationalists are weaponizing anti-Semitism. This is not good for the Jewish people. And then who are they weaponizing against? Well, one of the largest identity groups on campuses in these anti-war protests against the Israeli, and now an ethnic cleansing genocide that our own country is proposing. These anti-war protests, one of the largest identity groups on campus, at my campus, definitely, were Jewish students.
Yeah.
You see this in Germany, too. I saw, a tweet somewhere, Germany running out of Jewish intellectuals to ban. It's Jewish people who are criticizing it. I mean, Palestinians, lots of people are criticizing Israel, but Jewish people are too. And so there was recently an article about how the very large, I was going to say the enormous support for Harris. Jews voted 70% for Harris, but Biden and Harris weren't great on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a very large, especially among the youth, movement to critique Israel, and even an anti-Zionist movement among young Jews today. And they're all being branded, these religious young Jews, they're all being branded as anti-Semitic by Christian nationalists.
It's wild.
Yeah.
So do you think then that has a lot to do with the younger generation having more access to education and information? Because I think it's interesting, because I feel like a lot of times the dominant group, whoever they may be, are sort of saying the same thing, like turning it on its head and saying, well, these universities are the indoctrinating force rather than the force for truth. And we are actually the force for truth, and we are losing people to these institutions. And I think that's something that we see right now as well in America.
Well, yeah. I mean, Yale has clearly been an indoctrination center. We produced J.D. Vance. We produced Ron DeSantis. Princeton produced Ted Cruz. Harvard produced Tom Cotton. So yeah, these are indoctrination factories. We produce these far-right authoritarians on a regular basis. That was a humorous remark. But
yes.
Yeah. So, but all these guys, all these would-be fascists and autocrats, I mean, I went to SUNY Stony Brook. I'm not one of these guys, but they all went to Harvard and Princeton, and so are their kids going to go to these schools in Yale. Ron DeSantis went to Yale and then Harvard. So yeah, so there's something weird going on with that. But you can't really indoctrinate the youth. The youth have their own views. And you know, a lot of what we're seeing is a reaction to that, is a reaction to an extremely progressive generation. And even they are reacting to each other because the youth far right is reacting to their progressive brethren among the youth. So we have a radicalization among the youth in both directions, far right and also left.
Right.
But the left isn't like attacking democracy. The far right is very fascism friendly and explicitly fascism friendly.
Yes. More after this. And now back to the show.
So, yeah, I mean, chapter 2 of How Fascism Works is called Propaganda, and it's how fascist propaganda works. And fascist propaganda works by projection. You always say the other side is doing what you're going to do. So, obviously, you know, patriotic education is indoctrination. And they're saying, the Trump administration is saying, we're going to end indoctrination and replace it by patriotic education. I mean, what the hell? You know, I mean, that's like obviously, I mean, and then when they talk about education, they're talking about creating these cartoon schools where you learn about the greatness of the nation. And, you know, you learn about how white men are so great and you learn to salute the flag over and over again. It's like something out of 1984.
Right.
You know, I mean, just picture in your head a cartoon example of an authoritarian nation. It's where you pledge allegiance all the time. And so that's what we're trying to do. They're trying to replace freedom of thought by that.
Yeah.
So now what you have in universities is, you know, the full panoply. I mean, people say, okay, universities have very few Republicans, and it's true. So we got to make sure universities have more Republicans. Fine. Open up the physics department to affirmative action for Republicans. Open up the math department to affirmative action to Republicans. There are hardly any Republicans in the Yale math department. So just forget the humanities and just do the hard sciences. You're going to have the same complaint. There are very few Trump supporters, almost no Trump supporters in math departments. There's a few very loud ones, but, you know, what, 90% of math departments consist of faculty who do not support Trump. What's the idea? Like affirmative action for the far right, affirmative action for it's just a fact. Mathematicians don't tend to like Trump in the United States. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to say, look, you got to bring in some mediocrities in math because they are Trump supporters? And I think the Trump administration knows this, which is why they're targeting scientists. They're targeting the scientific infrastructure. My science colleagues thought they wouldn't be targeted. But hey, they're all Democrats too. So the idea is they're going to destroy U.S. science, destroy U.S. Research because there aren't enough Trump supporters.
Right, right. And, you know, I'm thinking about when I went to a liberal arts college, Fairhaven in Western Washington University. I'll shout them out. And it really did open my mind to a lot of truths that had been suppressed and a lot of what you talk about in your book, structural issues that happen within the United States in our history in the current moment we were in. I mean, at that time, it was about the Iraq War and about Palestine and these things that I needed a light shined on in order to understand in any meaningful way. And what is so interesting about this battle that takes place at the university is like a fascist group pushing patriotic history has everything to gain from that. But what are the faculty gaining when they're just teaching about systemic issues? It's not like that's going to bring them some kind of power.
Yeah, it's interesting what's happening as billionaires are violating this country to pad their wallets. They're directing the country's ire and anger against high school teachers and professors as if they somehow control the country and are elite. Well, guess what? First of all, going to be a professor is one of the hardest things you can do. It's hard. There are hardly any jobs. I started out at Cornell as an assistant professor making less than $40,000 a year. Until I was, throughout grad school, I made $10,000 to $12,000 a year. I had elite positions and I was making a fraction of what this was during, go-go years of Wall Street. I was surrounded by 22-year-olds making like 6 times as much as I did. It's hard to raise a family on a professor's salary, and federal workers, same thing. So I was just teaching in one of my classes, Wilhelm Reich, and he talks about how the Nazis went after federal workers. They represented them as lazy.
Right.
They said they're lazy, they're earning, and the federal workers didn't earn that much money. They had job security. But what the Nazis were trying to tell the working class is they were saying, look, they're just above you in terms of their social status.
Right.
So we're going to destroy them. We're going to traumatize them. We're going to make people hate them. I mean, they made people hate them by saying, well, they think they're better than you. Right. So that's what's happening is, most professors are working class people. They make $60K. They've got a family of 4. They have precarious employment, except for the few who have tenure. Then they make $80K and have a family of 4, and they have to live. You can't, as a professor, live where you want. If you get a job at Illinois State, you have to move there, even if your family is somewhere else. It's one of the most difficult jobs imaginable. And yet, these billionaires are saying they're the problem. School teachers making $40K a year are the problem, not the billionaires who've immiserated us and just run the country. No, it's the elementary school teachers, the junior high school teachers, the high school teachers, and the professors and the federal workers, not the billionaires.
So it seems like they also are pitting the idea of who is a hard worker, because it seems like work, the power of the worker, is the most important part of what fascists want to extract from the population. It's like your value, and I know this was true in Nazi Germany, your value was based on the labor that you could do. And they're looking at, and they're pitting the working class, the real laborers, against, these professors that have these cushy jobs and sit in their, ivory tower, even though you're making a similar amount of money and struggling in the same ways.
Yeah, the whole idea is to create this fictional concept of work where white collar work that is not coding. So somehow sitting on a desk and coding is work, but sitting on a desk and proving theorems or writing essays about history or analyzing the history of white supremacy is not work. So, it no longer has to do with whether you're sitting on a desk or not, because, if you're sitting on a desk and coding, that counts as work. If you're sitting and making a $1 million bonus for yourself on Wall Street, that's work. But sitting in an archive and researching the history of Nazi Germany or the Ku Klux Klan, that's not work. So there's this fictional concept of work, and you use that fictional concept to say billionaires are hardworking. College professors are lazy. Federal workers are lazy. The people who sacrificed being and working in private law firms for 10 times their salary to work for you to make sure the banks aren't ripping you off. Of course, they went after the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau because that limits the power of the bankers.
Right. Oh, okay. So maybe we should get into what's happening right now a little bit. Your book came out before the election, and I even thought of you. I was like, oh, I really hope Trump doesn't win this election because Jason Stanley's job's about to get a lot harder.
Thank you for the concern.
Now that we're here, Could you explain to us what we are already seeing in terms of the future of the Trump administration's idea of what education should be and how you think that's going to continue to unfold and, what you see them putting in its place? You've talked a little bit about it, but if you could expand on that, I think it's really important.
Yeah, so they're trying to destroy the university system. It's the one thing we unquestionably do better than anyone in the world.
Right.
So they're trying to just take it down. Like, it's not just the humanities. You can't really have humanities in a dictatorship or a one-party state because their job is to critique, even if you don't like the critique. That's their job. That's our job.
Yeah.
Our job is to take your beliefs and subject them to criticism. But they're going after the sciences too. They're going after the whole structure. So they want to take down the university system. So the question is, can the university systems fight back? Fortunately, a lot of universities have law schools. So people in law schools like to fight. But they're also taking down the courts and they're also taking down the media. And they're using this concept of DEI to do it. Basically, they're saying that all of these places have DEI, so we're going to just cut off the federal funding. One of the main reasons the U.S. is the most has done the best research in the world since World War II is because of a marriage between the federal government and the research system. NIH, NSF, National Institute of Health, and National Science Foundation fund research. Government is trying to end that, and that will take down our universities. It will be to the benefit of Canadian universities, of universities in the UK. Continental Europe has to get its act together with respect to its higher education system. But this will massively benefit. Students will be flowing to the University of Toronto, for example. If you can take out the university system, it's hard to replace. It's hard to, like, University of Berlin was the greatest university in the world before World War II.
Right.
Guess what? It hasn't been like that since World War II. The Nazis destroyed the universities. So they're trying to do that, take down the university system. That's going to cost a lot in terms of jobs. It will destroy it looks like a frontal assault on the United States itself. The education system, they're going to, our students are already not doing well because of repeated attacks. Who wants to be a teacher when you're so vilified by one of the major parties? And the salaries are horrific. So they're going to double down on that. They're going to remove what little career safety and protection teachers have. The United States is at another pillar of the U.S. university system is the widespread use of tenure. So that's why U.S. universities can hire anyone from anywhere else. But that's going to end soon. Yeah. You'll see professors moving to Canada. You'll see them trying to get to any university system that's free. I mean, that is where you can have free inquiry.
Right.
And you're not like vilified in the country so much. So as Trump said, I love the poorly educated. So Americans will become less and less educated, more and more patriotic, and the country will be taken down and will just be another larger banana republic.
And how are we seeing that? And how will we, in your opinion, see it play out in like K through 12 public schools?
I have friends in Hungary who've seen their kids go from being in an excellent education system to just having to deal with course after course of patriotic blather and nonsense about the Hungarian past. They've replaced Imre Kertész's work in the national curriculum, who's the only Hungarian Nobel Prize winner in literature, I believe ever, but certainly after World War II. And he's Jewish and writes about things from a Hungarian Jewish perspective, which is that community obviously had a very difficult past.
Mm-hmm.
They removed him from the national curriculum. They placed several writers into the national curriculum who are just, frankly, losers, like sucky writers, far-right Hungarian nationalists. And now all these poor Hungarian kids have to read this crappy literature about how great Hungary is. So, they learn about Hungarian folk dances or whatever. My friends in Hungary are like, it's like a large part of the school curriculum is just pointless. It's like learning nonsense. So it'll be a lot of learning nonsense here. Anything that's not science and math, but they're targeting the schools. So science and math education is going to be terrible too, because who wants to be a teacher now? Who wants to be a professor? It's already economically really hard. If you take away the job security, which is the big, great thing about being a teacher, and so that makes up for the lack of income. That's always been the case. They use job security against classes of workers. The Nazis used it against the federal workforce. They say, you don't have job security. They do. So they're the enemy. So everything to distract you from the billionaires who are rapaciously conquering the country and taking it down brick by brick. So the education system is just going to transform into, babysitting for your kids as they're taught nonsense and have to salute the flag again and again and again. And we've seen a full-on attack, making it a nightmare to be an elementary school teacher, a high school teacher, a high school principal. That's the goal, to make it an utter nightmare. Basically, to direct the different groups in society who are not the billionaires to just eat each other alive.
Yeah, I know at least 2 teachers in the K through 12 system that have actually had to quit their jobs because they've gone to school board meetings in attempts to defend banned books or to defend their students who are queer. And they've been run out of the area and threatening phone calls, people showing up at their house, other parents, claiming that they're traffickers or somehow, aiming to mutilate children. And it's just this really scary moment to be a teacher who is interested in the defense of their own students. And I'm curious now if in other countries that you've studied who have fallen into fascism, are they going to incentivize right-wing or far right-wing people to become teachers? Is it going to become an easier, better paid job because they want to be able to have these indoctrination centers?
Probably varies, but
Okay.
Ron DeSantis, the autocrat in Florida, they have, I think, bonuses for teachers who have to go through Christian nationalist. I've read about sort of training that involves Christian nationalist ideology, I think run by Hillsdale College. I talk about this in my book. But in that kind of autocratic place like Florida, there are some financial incentives, but they've also removed protections from teachers, career protections.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a standard thing. Like the University of Wisconsin in Madison always paid lower salaries than the elite privates. But it was just as good a university because they had the strongest tenure protections in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Scott Walker, the governor, removed those tenure protections. Now it's a lot harder for the University of Wisconsin and Madison to recruit. Certainly they can't recruit against the top privates anymore. So tenure, job security is an enormously big incentive for people. And of course, the Republicans use that in their politics, like the billionaires. Look away from the billionaires who are slashing regulations so they can use the government to enrich themselves, and massive tax cuts so they can bankrupt your school systems to support their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids' trust funds. So, maybe there'll be a one-time bonus or increase in salary from these pitiful salaries that they're already making, but at the cost of removing one of the things that makes people go into that low-paying profession in the first place.
More after this. And now, back to the show. So, you mentioned DEI. That's obviously one of the biggest words we're hearing every single day. And I think that there is, when we talk about work being of central importance, the labor of each individual person being of central importance, there seems to be this implication, if not outright message, that people who have been, whatever it means to be put into their position through DEI, again, I say that kind of as their perspective, that those people are, somehow not up to the task, or they are lazy in some way and they don't deserve what they are getting. And so what do you think about kind of the message around DEI and labor? Because I think labor is something I want to try to talk about as much as possible in terms of what's happening with our perspectives in class.
Yeah. Well, of course, the fascist movement smashed labor unions because their goal is to pad the pockets of the wealthy who are the billionaires who are supporting them. So they go after the labor unions, which are the basis of support. The DEI stuff, it's just like we're going through a harrowingly racist time.
Yes.
And let's be frank, I know plenty of upper class white racists who go on about, the large percentage of Americans. 2010, there was a study showing that 51% of white Americans agree with the statement, Black people are lazier than white people.
Yeah.
And I'm white, so I know that there are plenty of people who harbor these viciously racist attitudes and are glad that Black people are getting theirs, as it were, that, that's just America. You're not, they're making it illegal to say that in universities. So you can't say that's America. But that's our history. So this is a very bad moment for open racism.
Right.
And it's just like everybody knows what DEI means. It means Black people. And, it doesn't mean South Asians. I've been looking to see if a single South Asian is called a DEI hire. And I have not yet seen a single one. No one's calling Nikki Haley a DEI governor.
Right.
But yeah, the attack on DEI is just old school American racism. Black people are supposedly incompetent. So they're making it really hard. The goal is to make it really hard to hire anyone who's Black, because if you hire someone who's Black, they better be 10 times as good as the white candidate. And then it's all a joke, right? Because the people that they're hiring are the most incompetent clowns and buffoons in the world. Meritocracy just means you believe the 2020 election was stolen. That's literally the question they're asking to replace federal workers who are supposedly DEI hires.
Yeah.
Do you believe the 2020 election was stolen?
Jesus.
Meritocracy means that you believe the 2020 election was stolen. And the clowns they're putting in the administration are obviously the most meritless class of people ever.
Yeah.
So, as I said, the United States is going to be a banana republic with a lot of nuclear weapons.
Yep.
And of course, they're using America's greatest sin, anti-Black racism, to destroy the United States.
Absolutely. And this reminds me of a quote that I wrote down from your book that I really liked, that I'd love to talk about a little bit. You said, when a group of people is represented as having no history, they are being denied any valid claim to the present. Western colonialism relies on a set of presumptions about the nature of history itself. And I was hoping you could talk more about those presumptions and what they do to benefit the dominant group.
Right. So there is a concept from the literature on colonialism called the civilized savagism paradigm. And the idea is you say that the group you're trying to colonize are savages. And in exchange for making them labor for you, you're going to give them, work skills and Christianity, usually, if it's European. So the idea is, we'll enslave Black Americans and then we'll teach them Christianity and we'll give them work skills by forcing them to work. So whenever you want to take something over, you say the people are uncivilized and incompetent and they need us to run the show. So this happens in subtle ways, like in Michigan with the Emergency Manager Act that led to Flint, Michigan, the disaster in Flint, Michigan, where they replaced the city councils of the 6 largest Black majority cities with an unelected emergency manager who, of course, made ridiculous decisions to benefit private equities or whatever. So at one point, over 50% of Black people in Michigan were under an emergency manager, whereas less than 3% of white people in Michigan were under that. So that was like a sort of more subtle way. But what you do is you say there are these dysfunctional cities run by Black city councils and Black mayors, and we have to take them over. That's how you do it domestically in the United States. Colonialism has always worked. Like King Leopold of Belgium said he needed to conquer the Congo because, they were savages and they were like selling each other into slavery. And so they were going to go in and end the slave trade and be the benevolent leaders. And then they went in and they murdered 10 million Congolese in a very short time. They extracted rubber from the Congo and they cut off the hands of young Congolese children, murdered millions of them to get the rubber. this was supposedly helping them.
Right.
So this idea that the dominant group is just being nice to, like, slavery was actually in favor, according to this ideology, to Black Americans, because they were taught, as the Florida schools reputedly are saying, useful job skills.
Right. And if you are erasing the experiences and perspectives of people who have been like brutally victimized in this country, you also, like you're saying, you do this trick where you change the past and then you are able to present yourself as a victim. And you mentioned this in the beginning, but I do think the idea, because, you know, you see this in personal relationships too that become abusive, where the perpetrator makes themselves out to be the victim to kind of justify anything that they want to do.
Darvo is what's going on.
Yeah, Darvo's the word. Will you say what Darvo means for anyone who doesn't know?
What's the acronym stand for again?
Oh gosh, I was going to make you say it. Okay.
Darvo is denying, attacking, and reversing the roles of victim and offender.
Right.
So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing mass Darvo, but with groups rather than individuals. So you say, actually, it's so look at what's happening with South Africa. Suddenly the white Afrikaners are the only people allowed to come to the United States as refugees because the Trump-Musk regime wants to say, I think might be Musk who's actually the president. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it seems to be true.
But the Musk-Trump regime is completely erasing and reversing the historical narratives. Now it's supposed to be, actually, it's the white Afrikaners who were the victims in South Africa.
Right, right. I think it's also interesting when we talk about history because, you know, the show that I make, our team makes, is very much an attempt to get at the truest version of history, even when that's, you know, challenging to the views that I already hold. And the way that I try to do that is by collecting as many perspectives, as many stories of experiences, as many old newspaper articles, anything that I can kind of collect to put together what feels like it approaches the truth, right? Because truth is a very hard thing, especially in history. But the Fascist Project really wants that to be gone. They want any complicated past to be erased, and they want basically a single, simple narrative. So how does that help them in their goals?
Well, a democracy requires multiple perspectives because you have to understand your fellow citizens. If you can't understand your fellow citizens, if you just have one narrative, anyone who deviates or criticizes that narrative can be represented as a traitor.
Right.
So in America, it'll take the form of like venerating billionaires and industrialists. Yeah. And, you know, if you criticize that, if you say maybe some people shouldn't own all the cookies, then you can be represented as a traitor. So here it's a marriage of capital. It's an oligarchy. With a fascist leader who's also an oligarch. So what you can do is you essentially keep people loyal to the ideology of the leader, the ruling party, the oligarchs. And so then you make people think that anyone who criticizes that is a traitor to the nation.
Right. And it does feel like the group that is most being used to create moral panic and prop up the new administration are immigrants. And of course, we hear lots of people talking about how immigration is a key part of America's past. So how have we kind of rewritten the story of immigration to serve the narrative that's being created?
Well, the United States had a long period where it was very anti-immigration. Mm-hmm. That's what affected Hitler. Hitler praised America. America sealed its borders. I mean, we sealed our borders from European Jews when they were being faced genocide. So that's why I tell my fellow Jewish people who are in support of this, I'm like, oh yeah, so you are pro-genocide of Jews because The very same America First policies that kept us out of the United States and subjected us to Hitler's wrath are what you're for.
Right.
So I wouldn't say that the take of, say, Stephen Miller is so inaccurate. This is our past, and he's not wrong about that.
Right. So I think a question that I am continuing to have in this very overwhelming time is that when we're thinking about the rewriting of the past to some mythic past, to some, patriotic story, if you're one of the dominant group, or you, let's say, perceive yourself to be part of the dominant group, or you hope to be part of that dominant group, even though it's kind of a mirage, it seems like it would be really attractive to get to slip into this narrative, this heroic narrative, this victim narrative, this like, I'm the great one narrative. I'm curious if you or anyone you know or any programs or anything like that have had success of wrenching people out of a fantasy that for many probably feels really good.
Well, I just present analyses of things. So in my classes where I teach this material, many of my classes are logic or whatever, but in classes where I teach this material, I just teach what happened in the U.S. past, for instance. I mean, I'm a philosopher, not a historian, but so I look for the structures, the common structures, but I'll teach history to look at the structures. I'll look, they didn't allow schools to teach the history of slave rebellions. They taught them that Black people didn't do anything in the Civil War and were freed entirely by white people. They sort of reinforced these myths of Black inferiority. They said Black people got the vote taken from them because they were incompetent as politicians. And I think teaching people that kind of history is obviously effective, which is why they target it.
Yeah. Well, Jason, this has been so great. I am curious about how it feels. We've talked a lot about the history and we've talked a lot about what's going on, but I am curious how it feels for you to be a professor, to be an educator with everything that's going on, and how you and your colleagues are coping and trying to move forward.
Well, I don't like bullies, so I'm totally fine to be in a time where there's a lot of bullies around in politics. So as soon as the Ukraine war started, I got myself a position in the Kyiv School of Economics, and I've been going there to Ukraine twice a year because I don't like bullies. So I'm fine with this moment. It's a panicked moment for my colleagues. I do see a bunch of my colleagues really organizing. We created at Yale an AAUP chapter, American Association of University Professors. There's real clarity among a lot of my colleagues that this is an existential moment for our country, and that universities stand at the front lines. Other colleagues are panicked and afraid and are just seeking to, be as safe as possible. That's true across these targeted industries: education, media, and the courts. Right.
Yeah, it is a panicked moment, and I appreciate your desire to stand up against bullies. I share the same desire. And, hopefully we just increase our solidarity, and that's all we can work on doing. So, Jason, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for continuing to stand up against bullies.
Likewise, Chelsey.
This was American Hysteria. Make sure you grab a copy of Jason Stanley's Erasing History and check out his other books as well. If you want to support our show and make sure that we can continue making it, you can go to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get ad-free episodes as well as bonus content, like the other podcast that I do with our producer Miranda called Hysteria Home Companion, where we tell you stories related to the topics that we're covering or stories that we know that you'll love. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. Another really great way to help our show out is to leave us a 5-star review on whatever app you're using. We also encourage you to go to AmericanHysteria.com and leave us a message on our Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up or even one that you've heard recently. We might do an entire investigation about it, and you can also pick up some of our merch at AmericanHysteria.com. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius Smith, and I'm your host, Chelsey Weber Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening. I hope you're hanging in there, and despite it all, I hope you have a great week.